Okay, so let's talk about requirements engineering. Right, so we're going to spend some time talking about some of the aspects of what the challenges of gathering requirements, representing those requirements, some of the jargon, right, behind the process of managing requirements. So we want to first understand what is a requirement. What is it? So basically, it's just a feature, right? The software needs to be able to do so and so, right? So there's a formal IEEE definition of what a requirement is, but eventually you come to the conclusion it's just a feature that or a service that a product or application needs to provide. Right? Now there's different types of requirements depending on who you talk to. Right? Depending on the audience who you talk to, they'll be giving you things requirements are very, very high level or very, very specific. Okay? So depending on who you speak to. If you speak to a business folks, right, they'll be giving you requirements are very, very high level, right? That they want to make sure that they have so many sales at the end of the quarter. They want to make sure that folks are not returning their products. They have very, very high level requirements about the business in general, right? And they have very long-term requirements that are going to be by the end of the semester, by the end of the quarter, or by the end of the year, right? If you go a little further down, if you talk to an actual person who's using this product, they might be telling you about how awful an application is and all the pain points, how they hate it or how they love it, the application. So they'll have first-hand description about that application, right? And all those pain points, right, and all the good things or bad things that they might tell you about, those are all user requirements, right? These are all things that the user's point of view, right? They might not know anything about the implementation, but they know about the day-to-day usage of the application. If you talk to a developer, right, they'll be talking about all sorts of functional requirements, right, on how how you sort a particular list of users, on how you iterate and display different, whether you're using a tree structure to search for something, or you're collapsing things and different ways to display the data. So if you talk to a developer, they'll be talking about all sorts of functional requirements of what is it that you're building. Also, if you're talking to maybe some administrators, they'll be telling you lots of things about non-functional requirements, about how secure it is, and how how many times what was the ratio of faults last quarter, of how many hours was it available, the application was available, all sorts of things that are also very important, right, but are not things that are anywhere visible for a user or a developer. So there's quite a few types of requirements depending on who is it that you're talking to, right? So here's some examples of business requirements. Somebody might say that I want to reduce the incorrectly processed orders by 50%, or I want to increase the repeat orders by 10%, right? So very high level. At the end of the year, how we're going to do by quarter or by the end of the calendar year, right? From a user's point of view, right? So they like to be able to do a couple things, right? These are the goals that they want to be able to achieve as they're using your application. These are the things they would like to be able to do, right? They would like to be able to see an order history. Right? I like to go to Amazon and see everything that I've ordered this year, right? And maybe I want to select a particular order. I want to see the details for that particular order. Right? Or maybe an order that still hasn't been delivered, maybe I want to be able to cancel. So that's another user requirement. I want to be able to cancel an order. All right? So all these features, not specifying on links and buttons or actual implementations, are things that I want to be able to achieve. So those are what are user requirements. And you might have a narrative story that specifies more details about the cases and the constraints about that particular requirement. Now, as we'll see in a minute, user requirements are also documented using what is called use case analysis, right? That formally specifies what are the steps, generic steps that a user would follow to to add a new customer account or view an order history or check order status. You know, what are the steps that they would follow to achieve that goal? Functional requirements are, you know, from a developer's point of view, what is it that I would actually implement, right, for a particular user requirement? Right? How is it that a developer would implement, you know, adding a new customer order or implementing a view order history? How would they implement that? Well, there has to be, I'll need to implement a list of orders. Yes? I'll need to be able to provide some buttons for being able to navigate into the history of that or details about that particular order. Or provide a button for you able to click on and cancel that order, and things like that. Yes? So functional requirements are more specific. It's usually from one user requirement, you'll have many functional requirements, right, of how is it you're going to implement that goal. Make sense? Or even a user requirement might have multiple steps. Or it might have 3 or 4 steps to fulfill this, and each one of those steps might be 2 or 3 or 4 functional requirements. Make sense? So you start with the user requirements, you go to the use case analysis, and then you go to functional requirements for implementation. Okay? Other non-functional so non-functional requirements you have, you know, allow up to 200 concurrent users. You had a question? Yes.
Eliminated, or would some of them, would there also be like a case where they could also be kept because it's like a long structure?
Yeah. Well, so typically when you provide a functional requirement, is that you're presumably making a commitment on implementation, right? And that's usually when a developer gets the functional requirement. Ideally, you have the capability of a developer, for instance, questioning that requirement. Right, and saying, well, why are we building this, right? And then questioning the validity of the user requirement that this came from, right? And being able to just say, actually, you know what, we don't really need that use case or that particular user requirement, right? Or presumably you also everything starts with business requirements, right? And from business requirements as well, how is it that we can improve this? Represented as user requirements, so that we can make the life easier for our users, so that they come back and repeat, right? Or we reduce the amount of errors, right? So what are the user requirements that will fulfill that business requirement, right? And then all the way down to the bottom. And at any point, you know, you're expected to question that requirement, right, and the validity of, you know, go back and say, well, what were my assumptions at the top, as well as whether it's complete, right? You're only telling me the requirement in steady state, right? But you're not talking to me at the beginning or once you have too long, when you have lots and lots of users. So in a particular implementation might be fine for a small subset, but be fine for something that is very large. You know, usually in computer science we always think about the you know, especially if you're looping, right? So, well, what happens in the first iteration and what happens in the last iteration, right? And we're thinking, well, how should a page look like when it's empty, or when it has lots of data, right? A particular assumption might be, oh, well, you're going to scroll through each one of these, and when you have millions of records, so you haven't thought about pagination, you haven't thought about, you know, filtering, and you haven't thought about any of this until you're actually going to implement them, and you would create other user requirements, right? That would from having started implementing a functional requirement. So there's always a lot of dynamic back and forth, right? Of these requirements varying over time, right? And yeah, all this, and that's why Agile has abandoned the trying to come up with all the requirements up front, right? They'll have a very high level sketch of what the core functionality they want, but not until you start selecting a particular user requirement and questioning it, is that when you start generating new functional requirements and then back and forth determining what is going to be built. Yep. All right, so other things. So implementation requirements, right? So it must work with IE7. Some business rules that are specific to, specific to the business that has to. Some restrictions about the legality, that it has to, folks can't work more than 8 hours, or it can't be open on weekends, or it's not available between 10 and 12, right? So all those kinds of rules also impact on the decisions of what it is that we're going to be building. Scope, what we mean by scope is the overall collection of things that are going to be built, right? That we can agree, all right, this is what we're going to be building. And that scope, unfortunately or fortunately, changes over time, right? And that the body of work that we need to be building, right, changes over time. And everybody in the organization needs to understand that it does change over time, right? That you can't just pile on more and more scope and assume that the project is still going to be within the same budget of time or financially. So everybody in the organization needs to understand that this is negotiable, right? You can either give me a fixed amount of scope to work on, and then we can decide on when to deliver it, or you can give me a fixed amount of time, and then we can decide what scope is, right? But you can't fix both, right? What we're going to be doing in this particular amount of time, right? So it needs to be negotiable. So scope, and there's a bad word here, scope creep, is the fact that the scope tends to just increase over time, and we need to have processes around that. Stakeholders is a term for all the folks that are interested or have some kind of interest in the application succeeding, right? They could be they could be managers. These could be folks in different sections of the organization, engineering, sales, marketing, all sorts of folks that are interested in this succeeding, especially folks that are putting money into this, right? That are budgeting or giving are sponsoring a particular project, might have a say in this. Certainly the folks that are going to be using this product eventually also they have a stake in this, and everybody needs to participate in the gathering of these requirements, right? And usually you have folks that are dedicated to the gathering of this information. Usually these are the business analysts, right? That invite everybody, and then through several weeks or months gather all that. Requirements management, as I mentioned earlier, these requirements are going to change over time. We need to set up a process by which we are going to allow these requirements to change over time, right? Usually it will be a submission, a request of change, right? A request of change of requirement, and it goes to some committee that that oversees all the requests that were made to change the original requirements. And they will oversee it. They will talk to architects, and they will talk to all sorts of the stakeholders, and says, "Are you okay with this change? Does everybody agree with this change?" Right? And they will be converted into stories or use cases, and put in some backlog of that the software development team will then grab them. They will be prioritized, and then we'll grab them and schedule it to some particular sprint or some particular quarter that's going to be addressed at, right, or a particular phase of the project. But there has to be some formal requirements management process, right? It's just not chaotic, right? We can all agree. So there's some, these are the 5 generic steps in the requirements. You first define it. You make sure that you can trace it, right, to make sure that you have a unique identifier from a business to a user to a functional to an actual code implementation. So you can see how a requirement has gone through all the way down to source control. Evaluate it, meaning you have a requirement, and folks are always challenging that requirement. Do we really need to implement that? Right? Do we really need to spend the money and the time? Is there a manual way of doing this instead? Do we have to automate it? Right? Because a lot of folks will say, well, yes, they want everything, and us as developers, as engineers, we always need to question, right, and always challenge the requirements and the validity, whether we need to actually implement or a particular way of implementing it. Once it passes the challenges, we approve it for being incorporated into the changes, right? And then we need to track it and make sure that indeed is implemented. And this just goes around and around across the entire project life cycle. So we're in these. So these are the requirements process. We're in this very early stage. We're doing the discovery. Next week we're going to be doing analysis and modeling, and some validation, I guess. Where we're just doing some brainstorming. We're looking at some of the beginning of the project. We're looking at it. What are we asked to build here? We're trying to understand it. We're being asked to focus on just a couple of requirements. Certainly, we can come up with many more requirements from the project statement, but we're going to focus on just 3 of them. So we're doing the discovery phase, doing some prototyping, some horizontal prototyping for folks to look at it and say, "Ooh, I don't like these pages." Next week, we'll talk about planning, and we'll start modeling, creating some Java classes, maybe some UML class diagrams to represent and document these requirements. Validation, meaning, are we still building this? Always at every step we're going to be challenging requirements, right? So they're never set in stone, and be able to the team to be ready to be able to negotiate depending on the relative importance of the requirements. The stakeholders, oftentimes the folks that really need this application to be built, they're some of the folks that are promoting this application. They're probably the ones who are putting the money here, right? And so there's probably some of the more important stakeholders, and so they have also some responsibilities, right? They're the ones who actually want this, right? And they probably have a particular vision of why do they want it, a particular business model, or how they're going to convert this and monetize this. So they probably understand the business side of this better than anybody else, right? So they have to make themselves available for us to have questions. We're not going to have the same vision that they have. We're not going to have the same experience that they have. So we're going to have lots and lots of questions. And we're going to have to go back to them and ask them lots and lots of different questions. So they have to make themselves available, right? Spend the time to educate us about the business, right? Make sure that when they write a business requirement, that's clear, that is not contradictory, that you actually need this, right? That you're not going to waste people's time implementing something you're not going to need, right? And that we're going to have lots and lots of questions, so they're going to have to be able to answer those questions, give us feedback in a timely fashion, so that we can then feed it back into the process. Also, they have to spend some time on prioritizing, right? So because they have a particular time frame that they want this by, usually certain requirements will have some relative importance compared to other requirements, right? If you leave it to the stakeholders, everything's important. Everything's extremely important, okay? And that's impossible, right? We can't just start. We have to be able to identify what are we going to start working first. Just in case we run out of budget, at least you'll have something at the end of when we run out of budget. You'll have some core functionality. So what should that be, right? So we have to challenge them too. It says, if you had one thing that you could do, what would it be, right? So now once you put them against the wall, right, and you start forcing them, and you start asking, but why do you want that? And they'll say a couple of things, and then you ask them, but why? And then you challenge them again. And then the 5 whys technique is that you start exposing some of the subjectivity of these folks, right? That they might have very personal bias that does not represent reality. Yes. So always challenge. As a developer, right? As part of the engineering team. So yes, we need to prioritize. So and we need to help them prioritize, because for them, from their point of view, everything's important. Everything's critical. Requirements elicitation is the process of gathering the requirements or discovering these requirements. Usually we come up with lots of forms for folks to fill out, questionnaires for folks to fill out, We invite folks to brainstorming sessions, and some business analyst at the board, manages those meetings, and people are yelling out, what is it that they would like, and folks are challenging folks in the same room, and the business analyst helps the meeting go forward. And folks and some software engineers on the side are building prototypes, right? And displaying on the screen for folks to kind of give an idea of what is it that they're building, right? So that they can visualize it and critique it, and then elicit even more questions, more requirements. So that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be creating one of these horizontal prototypes, right? Ideally, presumably, for the clients to look at it and say whether they like it or not, and give you some feedback on it, right? We don't have time to actually do that in reality, but that's really what would happen in a real environment, right? The client would give you feedback on that. Yeah, so you have all requirements workshops that are a few days long, and then you collaborate with and identify the use cases and identify the functional requirements. Right. Another technique is to shadow folks that are currently using the system. Right. You kind of look over their shoulder for a whole day and make their life kind of awkward, and see where the pain points. Right. Where are they? Where's their faults? How is the application? Where is it working? Where is it not working? Right. And they can readily show you. See, when I get to this particular screen, it's asking me something that I have to go and fetch over here. Right. It's not very productive. It'd be easier if I would have side by side, and so they would give you lots of ideas on what the requirements might be. Yes, so that's also very, very common. Feedback sessions, build prototypes, requirements analysis. So one of the aspects of requirements, that as we validate them, we want to ask them: is this requirement? Does it have these three particular attributes? Is it correct, right? Does it represent reality, right? Or is it somebody's subjectivity? Is it in conflict with something else, right? So it cannot be that two conflicting requirements are both true at the same time. And the other one is understood. Do we all fully understand this requirement? So another particular aspect is whether it's testable, which was not listed. At the end of an analysis process, you come up with user interface models where you specify the different wireframes and different pages and how they navigate amongst each other. You have a catalog of all the requirements in prioritized order, saying what is the relative priority between all the requirements. Various horizontal prototypes of some of the more interesting web pages, prototypes, so folks can see an example of what they might look like. All the use case analysis with various use cases, and the business process model. And somebody's going to be responsible for documenting all these requirements, which we will start in today's assignment. Right, we'll go forward and document this as we go as we continue forward, and you'll be responsible for maintaining and updating that document. Validation, as folks give us requirements, one of the things that is very important is that they provide an objective way that we can validate that we have achieved that requirement. Right? Is an objective measure, right, that we can perhaps even implement as an algorithm, or maybe as a unit test, right, or some user interface test that validates that a particular requirement has been fulfilled. Right? So as part of the description of requirements, we want to make sure that they provide these validation mechanisms. Right, that they provide a testable means of validating that the requirement has been fulfilled. That the requirement is feasible. Can we actually build this? Whether it's actually necessary, right? That and again, question the requirements at all steps. It's unambiguous, meaning that you don't have different ways of interpreting the requirement. And surely, through the project statement that went out today, right? I'm sure I'm going to have 80 some odd interpretations of, of certain requirements. And so that's what I'm asking you to fill out your assumptions on how you interpreted certain requirements that seem to be vague, right, or might be ambiguous, or might be even contradictory. And also prioritizing the relative importance of these requirements. Now, the format that we're going to use for capturing these requirements is use cases. And also the UML, the Unified Modeling Language, right? Universal Modeling Language is the industry standard of a set of diagrams that are popular for capturing or documenting these use case analysis, and that's what we're going to be using in this assignment. Traceability, as I mentioned earlier, these requirements will have some unique identifier that allows you to make sure that every single line of code is related to some to some requirement that's being implemented. At each, as the requirements are become more and more mature, we ask the stakeholders to sign off, right? To say, hey, this is the body of requirements that we have gathered. This is our understanding. This is the user models. These are the functional requirements that we understand what we're going to be building. I need a signature and say, okay, do you agree that this is what we're going to be building? Not as a form of contract saying that, oh, careful, you can't break this contract, but more as a milestone, right? That we have achieved a level of confidence, that we feel confident that yeah, I think we could build this. You know, that I think we're ready to start going on this, right? And as a project milestone that we understand that some of this is going to change over time, but we feel confident that we can go further and start building this. So Agile modeling looks at this and says, you know, don't try to model this any further than it must be, right? That don't try to foresee all these requirements a priori. You know, just focus on some of the core features and some core requirements, but don't try to over-design this early on. It's futile, right? Only when a particular requirement is up for implementation in a particular set of sprints, then come back and do some more specific, some more in-depth analysis and implementation specifics. So lean, that's what Agile focuses on, and lean analysis. So we have some very, very high level analysis, whereas we leave the detailed analysis when we pick out something for implementation in a particular iteration. Requirements prioritization, as we mentioned earlier, we don't have infinite budget, we don't have infinite time, we don't have infinite resources, so we have to ask folks to provide some relative importance of what to build first in case we run out of the budget, right? Run out of time. So one of the common problems is that from the standpoint of the business, everything's important. You know, otherwise I wouldn't have told you, right? If we talked about it, it's important, right? So if I leave it to the business to prioritize it on their own, you know, we'll ask them perhaps to categorize things to be critical, right? Or have you know, what level of criticality, you know, low, medium, or high. Everything will be high, right? If we leave it up to them. Okay, so instead, we need to try and guide them in such a way that it'll be nicely evenly distributed. So there'll be some that are critical, you know, some that are middle, right, and some that are low. Not everything could be critical. That's impossible. So we have to help them in that, right? You know, depending on the resources and time and money and the quality that you want, right? We need to be able to prioritize. Right? If you could only do 3 things, what would you want it to be? Yes.
Is it more likely for those critical things that you talked about to be like for the business to place them on like sprints in advance and then keep like the low and medium stuff?
Exactly, but to be able to decide what goes in at the beginning of the sprint, we need to be able to have relative priorities between the two, right? So be able to say, if you look at these 2, right, which one would you build first, right? Yeah, at first you would say, well, they're all critical, but then one of the techniques is to say, okay, well, no, let's take 2 at a time, right? If you have these 2, if you had a choice, which of these 2 would you build? Says, okay, well, all right, okay, I have to go with this. Okay, fine, I'll take that out of the equation. And then you do pair by pair comparison against all the different requirements, and then you end up with some evenly distributed things of what to build and what not to build, right? And the things that become critical then are fed into the first sprints of what to build first, right? And also some implementation issues such as what things depend on each other that might force you to implement certain things first and certain things later, right? So you're not going to implement things that depend on each other, and you can't build one until the other one is built. So that also feeds into the equation there. But yes, you first have to have some prioritization to decide what is it that you're going to start working first, right? So identify those things that are most critical, right? And then focus on that. Okay. So prioritization has to be a collaborative effort amongst stakeholders and the developers and the owners and the clients, and and know these priorities are as early as possible, trying to identify some of the risk as well, right? So they must work together and identify things that might have some conflicting views, because you'll always find folks that in the same organization some folks are saying that this is very critical, and some other folks on the prioritization list is very low critical. So at some point you need to come to a consensus, right? And you have to help that process. A common trap is that you let it all to the customer. The customer chooses, and if the customer chooses it, everything. Oh, I don't have it somewhere here. Right, so they come up with something like this, where everything's critical, right, and you have very few that are important and desirable. But ideally, we would help these folks, come up with something that is somewhat have a curve, a more evenly distributed curve. So there's quite a few techniques that we can help them to guide them on what are the priorities, right? For instance, we might ask, hey, if we don't do this, will your business go out of business? Right. So that's a very putting in that term. Putting it, if they say no, then okay, well, it's not as critical as you might think. Right? Could we live without this? Right. And what about this? Do we need, if we don't do this, will your business will still be here next year? Right? It says, okay, well, no, we definitely need that, but otherwise I'm going to go out of business. Okay, so you can't put them in the same bucket. All right. Also, we need to challenge them and say, is there something that is manual that we can do? Right? That instead, not everything has to be automated. Right? Elon Musk tried to automate the building of his cars completely, and turned out that maybe there were a couple of things that humans still do better than robots. Right? And so it was much more expedient to have certain things still be manual, right? And leave them manual without automating them. Also, what can be deferred? It doesn't have to be done everything in this phase. Maybe we can break it out into quarters, and we address certain features at quarter one, and then certain features in second quarter and third quarter, and so on and so forth. As long as the stakeholders see progress and see all these features progressing, they will feel that they're moving forward, right? So there are two types of there are two aspects of prioritization. One of them is the scope, how much is it that you're going to be building, the things that need to be done, right? So you can prioritize that way, right, of all the things that need to be done. The other way to prioritize things is by scheduling, so by time, right? So all the things that you need to do, and how much time do you have to do them, right? And those two are resources that you need to play with. Right? And each one has different strategies on how to deal with this. I'm going to leave this to when we look at planning. When we look at planning, we'll revisit this. So I'm going to have that cover that then.